This is not something that we want to support off the cuff. However, there is a way that we can do this strategically, that we can mitigate the risk for producers right now. And this is not about lowering beef prices, and make sure that the market signals for them are to stay in business, that we're not going to influx cattle in from Mexico, and that this is a good time to stay in and the times will be good for them going forward.
That was Jenna Stanton, the Public Policy Director with the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, as today we're going to be talking about the recent announcement from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to slowly reopen the border to Mexican cattle to start coming north. And we're also going to be talking about the Brazilian imports and what the U.S. Cattlemen's is seeing with that. Also, we're going to talk about their meat demand monitor, as this dog days of summer are certainly upon us, hot temperatures. But that's all coming up here on Next Year Country. Of course, we're going to have our Next Year Country podcast without our great sponsors, and BNSF is from America's farms to tables around the world. BNSF Railway keeps agriculture moving, operating more than 32,000 route miles across North America. BNSF safely and efficiently delivers the products that feed, clothe, and power the communities that we all love. In fact, BNSF moves enough grain every year to provide a year's supply of bread for 1 billion people. Backed by 175 years of railroading experience, BNSF is proud to connect America's producers with markets across the nation and around the globe. BNSF Railway, delivering agriculture forward. Well, welcome back, gentlemen, back into the studio here. Of course, you guys were on the road last week and at the world-famous Sip and Dip. And boy, I got a chance to briefly listen into some of the podcasts. And Colton, appreciate the shout-out. Coulter gave me a shout-out as well on the Noon Market Report last week because I was at home covering the programs while these guys were... Colton was even playing golf. Let's not let him get off the hook on that one. But how did the golf go?
It was great. I hit the ball a couple times, so it was good. You know?
Great success.
More importantly, though, this is, of course, was for the first leg of the For the Farmers Tour. Coulter, what was your big highlight of the week for those 2 days of, well, really 3 days of For the Farmers, thanking them?
Well, so many highlights, so much fun. I mean, one of the highlights was, getting to do the podcast from the Sip and Dip. Andy, not as much fun as a co-host as a mermaid, just going to be honest there. So we got to get our picture taken with the mermaid. But really, the highlight for me, especially there, the golf course there in Conrad, just getting to talk with producers, and just the sense of relief was palpable that finally, after 5 or 6 years of drought, finally got the rain they needed, gonna be able to cut a decent crop this year. And you could just feel it from guys. They didn't know how much longer they had left that they could continue doing this, trying to farm with little to no rain. And so it's been a welcome relief to see the moisture come. And that was just the highlight, to be able to talk with guys and feel that sense of relief with them.
Probably helps a bunch, too, that while you guys were there, the grain prices rose about 50 cents in those 3 days that you guys were there. Probably helps a lot.
Yes, things looked a lot more profitable after we left and the market had bounced back so much.
It was a point of conversation for sure. Yeah, no, it was just really cool to hear. I think every single producer said that wasn't $1 million rain, it was $1 billion rain. And I mean, we heard anywhere from 6 to 10 inches in the month of June for a lot of these guys. And, there were some spots that they said their winter wheat, they had to start cutting a little early just for some frost conditions and whatnot. And other than that, the spring wheat and the other spring crops had looked absolutely tremendous. So definitely a lot of optimism that came from that.
Well, good stuff. We got a great podcast coming up today, as well as we mentioned the U.S. Cattlemen's Association. Jenna Stanton with the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, along with Jess Peterson, a man that a lot of people know in the industry, and he's got some great insight, too, as we look at the update of the USDA coming out on Friday, late Friday afternoon, saying that they're going to allow some Mexican cattle to start coming north, and also talking about those Brazilian imports that were announced earlier that excludes beef from being taxed and tariffed on those imports, and then also that meat demand monitor. But that's all coming up in a little bit. First off, we've had some big headlines. I just mentioned one of the biggest ones that we've been following all week, Colton.
Yeah, it's been hard to put the headlines together for this podcast when that's what our interview is talking about, is the USDA announcements. Of course, we can dive into the cattle on feed and biannual inventory reports, and we'll have you here for 4 hours if we can keep you around and talk about that. But when we take a look at some other headlines first, we'd like to give a big thanks once again to the Montana Farm Bureau Federation, because coffee shop talk is great, but having a real voice for agriculture agriculture at the table is even better. Become an advocate with the Montana Farm Bureau Federation and help protect the future of Montana agriculture. You can learn more at mfbf.org. And since we are going to be talking with Jess Peterson and Jenna Stanton about the USDA announcements, I thought we'd throw a little fun in the headlines here. Of course, Mr. Jim Rose just came out with a press release on the Montana FFA state officer team. They did their annual commodity tour where they started here in Montana, went all the way out to the PNW, kind of following the grain tour is what I know a lot of us know it as, and a pretty cool opportunity for those state officers just to be able to kind of get a different perspective. We see a lot of wheat fields and grain as they travel the state as a state officer, but to see where it actually goes, follow the river, see the commodity prices, go out to the UGC in Portland, pretty cool opportunity for those kids.
Well, Colton, you're the only one of us who's been on that commodity tour. Andy and I, of course, have both been to the Wheat Marketing Center. We've been to the UGC terminal, but you're the only one that actually knows what those kids got to see.
It's pretty cool. You get to go out. Of course, when I went, we were still kind of bouncing back from COVID. So the Wheat Marketing Center, we got to just briefly go in and you had to kind of keep your distance, which was a little unfortunate. But then they get to go on a tugboat that's obviously at the dock, get to see what that's all about, go out to the actual port, see some of the shipping containers sitting there waiting to come in to unload the grain. And then, of course, you get to hear all of Mr. Rose's stories from the countless years of going on that trip and hearing what some of the other state officers have done on that trip and some of their experiences. But I mean, you stop in Lewiston, Idaho, and you just keep going along the entire river. And it's super cool to see a lot of great opportunities that could have come from that. And of course, the big one for them is they're getting closer to school, kicking off here. It's just a big networking and connection opportunity for that state officer team.
I wonder if they got to drive the tugboat.
No.
Oh.
I mean, maybe they did. I don't think so. I know when we were there, they didn't. But
Andy had a very brief career as a tugboat driver there in the Willamette River.
I got to drive the tugboat, but then we're coming up to a bridge that was down, and I'm like, hey, dude, what's up? Like, there's a bridge up here. And he's like, yeah, I see that. And I'm like, what do you want me to do? And he's like, I don't know. I'm like,
don't hit the bridge.
Okay. I got my own boat now. I can drive a tugboat.
Wow, that explains so much for you, Andy. But, you know, another cool opportunity that the state officer team had here in the last few weeks in the beginning of July was they got to go to our nation's capital for the annual State Officer Summit. And that's a week-long event where they bring all of the state officer teams from across the entire country, bring them together to network and to advocate and just some education on becoming the future leader for our industry. And I was able to visit with Wyatt Johannes at a Huntley Project, who's the second vice president for the Montana FFA this year. And he had the opportunity as U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins was coming off the stage. Got to shake her hand. So I visited with him and he said that was a pretty cool opportunity and one that not a lot of kids get to have here. So I thought that was pretty special.
Well, especially with her being a past Texas State FFA officer, you know what FFA means to her and what it means to every kid across the country that's a part of it. So great that Wyatt was able to meet the secretary. I think he'd be a good representative that we could send as our delegate to visit with the Secretary of Ag.
I think so for sure. I was actually talking with his brother Cody today and he said, sounds like Wyatt's already planning his run for senator. So it sounded like a pretty eventful trip for Wyatt.
Well, I don't know. With family like that, he might have some challenges.
Yeah.
Oh boy. But another big headline here this week, of course, next week will be the 41st annual International Sweetener Symposium in Colorado. And that's kind of an industry we've been talking a lot, especially, as you look at last fall with Luther Markwart, the executive vice president of the American Sugar Beet Growers. He was talking about just the challenges in the sugar beet industry and the overall sugar industry as we look into some anti-dumping issues, all of the sugar imports. And then we were at the Coors Field Day here in Huntley and talking with Scott Lackman, and he talked about the challenges they're seeing in the field from drought and disease. And it's just a really tough time for those guys. And I know Luther was talking to some other broadcasters across the country and said that this symposium couldn't come at a more critical time for the industry.
Well, it's about as challenging a time as it could be for sugar beet growers. I mean, you look at where this year started with frost conditions. I know some that had to reseed 2 or 3 times. And so you can consider today's diesel prices. That's adding a lot of cost on there for what's likely going to be the lowest price they've ever received. It's hitting them from kind of all sides, not to mention the trade issues that we've got. So the sugar industry is in a challenging spot. And boy, it's hard to see a path forward. there was some ad hoc disaster aid that was sent out to the sugar industry early this year, and of course that'll be fed through the co-ops. But speaking of co-ops, that's another challenge because of course Western Sugar encompasses Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and a bit of Nebraska too, right, Andy?
Yep,
and so down south there in Colorado, a lot of those guys ended up taking Prevent Plant, and so they don't have the tonnage coming from there, and so that just makes it even harder to market when you don't have the volume that you're used to. So it's going to be a challenging time for our sugar beet growers. And I mean, no one wants to ask for federal help, but thank God we've got the sugar program, which is a no-cost program to taxpayers, because we're going to need this assistance. And really on the trade front, we've got to get our trading partners to not dump foreign sugar on the market. And it appears that that is what's happening.
I was talking to my friend Mark Rodriguez in Powell as well, of course, son of Rick Rodriguez, and they were talking about this heat on the sugar beets lately as well. And it's just crazy. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but sugar beets, when they get hot, they wilt to the ground pretty much, but they're still alive. You would drive by and you think, well, that sugar beet field's done, but it's not. They're actually protecting the root is what those plants are actually doing. And it's just really interesting to watch how they can shrivel up pretty much, but they're still photosynthesizing. They're still doing what they're supposed to do. Does it impact the sugar content? Sure. But Mark Rodriguez was telling me they sure look bad when you drive by them in this 100-degree, 95-degree heat that we've been continually having, but things are looking pretty good, at least in the Bighorn Basin for the Powell area anyways right now.
Well, and this couldn't come at, like we said, a more critical time. And Luther was talking about the level of leaders that are going to be present in the symposium. USDA Undersecretary Richard Fortas, Justin Benavidez, a lot of people that need to hear the conversations, need to hear from the growers and the producers that hopefully can take something back to the USDA and get some help, get some relief to those producers. But on the other side of it, this will be Luther's last sweetener symposium, as he has announced his retirement after 47 years. So obviously we're wishing him the best of luck in retirement and looking forward to see what he spends his time doing and as away from the sugar beet industry. But that's going to wrap up our headlines, Andy. I know we have a great conversation coming up to talk about maybe what's been the biggest headline so far in the month of July. And as we get ready for our interview, we'd like to thank Nutrilix for sponsoring that segment. Nutrilix, the total livestock supplement, liquid supplement, is specifically formulated to provide the nutrients your cattle need to maintain good health and provide a returnable income on your investment, especially in these summer drought conditions. It's easier and cheaper to supplement grass now than it is to feed excess hay later.
Well, back again here on your Next Year Country podcast, as we have had our friends from the U.S. Cattlemen's Association stop in and see us here. Of course, you all know Jess Peterson, Senior Policy Advisor with the U.S. Cattlemen's Association, and maybe the brains behind that as well as Jenna Stanton, Director of Policy and Public Affairs. And Jenna, this has been a busy week in the cattle industry. We saw that latest cattle inventory report come out. We saw the latest cattle on feed report, and that's been impacting the markets a little bit. But maybe one thing that is impacting the markets just a little bit more than that is the fact that the USDA late on Friday afternoon come out and said that they're going to be reopening at a slower increase pace of cattle coming from Mexico. This, of course, has been an ongoing issue with the New World screwworm in Mexico and southern states now for U.S. anyways. It's been in here since June, but now we're seeing it. The border's starting to get reopened. What was your guys' reaction when you saw that announcement come out that Mexican cattle are going to start to slowly come back into the U.S.?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think originally our knee-jerk reaction was, disappointed but not surprised. And I think one of the things we talked about at USDA is, we held it off as long as we could, as long as it made sense. But one of the things that we've talked about with USDA over the weekend, and we'll continue that conversation with them, is there's a lot of things that has to happen between Mexico and the U.S. before, that phased in at the end of August can really happen. There's a whole joint agreement, and there are very high expectations for Mexico that they need to comply with before we can really allow that phased in to start to happen. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what those numbers look like. We haven't seen any metrics from them as far as, per head per week or what all of that looks like or what type of cattle is going to be coming in. And so I think that there's a very strategic focus that we can take to it. USDA is very responsive to that. The secretary has been great on that end, that she's taking in all the feedback from the industry, and there's a lot of feedback. So I think that there's a good chance for us to give some input, and we're excited about that. And again, all hinges on, is is Mexico going to be able to come to the table and show up the way that we need them to? And I think that comes from really reporting cases, which we've done here in the U.S. very well. The screwworm website's updated every 12 hours, just really fabulous transparency from USDA on that side of things. Mexico doesn't really have that kind of infrastructure in place. That Matapa facility, so that fly facility that they're putting into Matapa, Mexico, we know that they're going through some kind of early stages of getting those flies ready, but they're not fully shelf ready at this point. So we just have that Panama facility that we're working off of. And then obviously that Moore Air Force Base facility is still quite a ways off from they're projecting into 2027, but have assured us that they're working as fast as they can to get that facility online. So that's really important. From the U.S. Cattlemen's perspective, one of the things that we have asked of them is just to make sure that producers have all the tools in the toolbox and that they are on the ground, ready and accessible. We know there's been great work done with the Texas Animal Health Commission, same in New Mexico, and the state vets are in a good place, and we want to make sure that those folks have everything that they need. But ultimately, what matters right now is the sterile fly drops, and making sure that if there's a case, there are good drops in those locations, in those quarantine zones, that everything is tip-top shape there. So we're paying attention to, I think, all the angles, and we understand the perspectives that, different feeders and other folks across the supply chain, were advocating differently than we were, and we understand that. But I think ultimately what's important to us is, who's going to feel the risk right now and the most immediate effects, and it's going to be your cow-calf producers. And if we get to a point where calf prices drop, but, American beef and ready beef in North America, beef prices themselves stay where they're at or they climb a little bit, that value is moving across the supply chain, but it's not making it down to the producers. And I think ultimately that's our concern. And I think it's a very real risk that we're in right now. So just making sure that this plan works for everyone across the supply chain. It can't just work to be an effort to lower beef prices in the immediate. There has to be more strategic focus, and it has to start with making it work for the producers.
I think we're seeing strings tugged opposite directions here with this announcement, and you understand where they're coming from. Like you mentioned, you can see the other side of the aisle, and you can also see this side of the aisle too, because when you take a step back, look at how long we've had the Mexican border closed. It's been a long time. We're starting to see kind of that tension come through as we're already looking at decade low numbers. Feed inventory continues to climb. We're trying to push these cattle to higher weights. That on its own could be a whole nother issue when we keep continuing to do this 6 months down the road, But on the other side, like you mentioned, Mexico doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure yet. But with this border closed, they have all this cattle backed up. It has to go somewhere. So they're starting to build that infrastructure. And so I think it was a necessity, one, to keep the competition alive from that aspect, but two, for the U.S. not to lose southern infrastructure in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, because the longer those borders are closed, the worse they are off. And so I think the USDA is trying to address that issue and try to find support for those producers. On the flip side, I feel like last year when we closed the border initially, because screwworm was getting closer to Mexico, we saw progress made. And then we opened the border for about 3 weeks, and we saw another detection get a little closer to the Mexican border, so we shut it down. Well, now we saw this announcement that screwworm is in the United States, and here we are, 3 months later, if that, and we're opening the border again. It seems skeptical. It kind of does.
It does. It does. And there is a lot of very natural, very normal skepticism that's I'm hearing over the weekend coming from the countryside. And we're hearing it from all different parts of the country. We've heard from a lot of our guys in Montana. Our Animal Health Committee chair is Mark Silverstein out of Big Timber. And, there's very low likelihood, knocking on wood, that, screwworm ever makes it to Montana, but it's a very real risk that will affect producers everywhere. Absolutely. And I think I'm completely aligned with you on that, Colton. And I think the best work that we can do at U.S. Cattlemen is making sure that USDA is hearing that. Obviously, the secretary's from Texas. I'm sure she's got all the Texas groups in her ear, and I don't envy her in that job at all. I would not trade places with her on that one. But it's important that she's hearing from everybody in the country, and that's our jobs, and that's the burden that we bear, and we're very happy to do it. So I think just making sure that on that vein too, it's going to affect different producers at different sizes, and different times of the year, who's selling at different times. And so I think that there's something interesting about it opening up during the summer too. Maybe if it had opened up in October, we might be in a little bit of a different place, and Absolutely. You might have heard a little bit of more aligned ruckus, I think. But coming up in the summer, right before August, things are kind of lulling down, especially out west. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how the next couple of weeks play out. And to your point too, USDA has made extensive investment in the Mexican capacity, and that's with the sterile flies and just making sure that they have the personnel on the ground. There has been huge investment made from USDA. We have to see Mexico show up with us in a way that makes sense, and we understand that there's different needs for different places, and we get that. But I think it's also interesting that this is coming at the same time time of, we just saw the USMCA announcement a few weeks ago. And, there's a lot of things in limbo, I think, between the two countries and especially in North America. So if there are places where we can work together with Mexico, I think that this is absolutely one of them and might set us better up in just our relationship with them in general.
That's a good point. I didn't necessarily take that into consideration. And to your point, as far as the seasonality aspect of it, I think there would have been a lot more alignment if it came late fall, early winter, because screwworm's not going to spread up north in the late fall when the temperatures start to drop fast, and we can use that as kind of a barrier. But on the other side, when we look at where the cattle market sits right now, we're in historic times. Of course, last week's video sale, with the recent pressure on the board, we did see some pullback on the prices. So going into the late fall sales, if we do open this border and there is start to be an issue, that could really pull that premium that we saw come into place when we closed the border, pull it out rather fast, and could hurt the producers quite a bit. But like you said, it's definitely exciting to see the investment that the USDA is making. That we obviously appreciate your work at US Cattlemen to stay up to date and be sure. Just curious, what's the message right now? We can talk about this from a 6-month perspective, 18-month, 4 years, 5 years. What is the message right now that you want to send to producers and members of the U.S. Cattlemen Association with this announcement?
Well, first of all, we're working around the clock. We're having conversations with the Texas delegation, New Mexico and Arizona delegations. We've had some conversations with the senators in New Mexico later today. And same with USDA. We are talking, we are advocating, we are making sure that voices on the ground are being heard in Washington, D.C., and having those subsequent conversations at the state levels too, in Texas and New Mexico specifically, in Arizona as well, as that's the port that's expected to be open. So I think that that's the first and foremost point that we want our members to make sure that, we have this under control and we're making sure that the conversation is on the correct vein. On the advocacy side, what's so important in our conversations with USDA specifically is this is not something that we want to support off the cuff. However, there is a way that we can do this strategically, that we can mitigate the risk for producers right now, and that it's important to talk about the rhetoric. This is not about lowering beef prices. That's probably not the effect that's going to be had anyway. We understand that that's the goal of different groups, and we understand that, grocery prices going into a really tough election season is on the minds of everyone. We understand that our producers are consumers too. They buy at the grocery stores as well. So that's important, but focusing on what can we do to mitigate the risk for producers at this point in time and make sure that the market signals for them are to stay in business, that we're not going to influx cattle in from Mexico and there's not going to be some crazy herd numbers here in the U.S. Obviously, we saw that report come out from USDA last week. We're getting maybe some signals of rebuilding, that this is a good time to stay in and that times will be good for them going forward.
Jess, one thing I think of too when we talk about the Mexican cattle coming across the border now, and I know this isn't an advocacy point for U.S. Cattlemen's Association, but we got to think about our friends in the rodeo business too. I mean, the Corrientes steers that have been, cut off from coming up north, that's kind of impacted the rodeo industry. What are your thoughts also on this whole Mexican cattle coming north now?
Yeah, I mean, if I stood up and said I care about the Corrientes cattle guys versus the cattle producers, I wouldn't have a job.
No, I'm not asking for that.
But if I had half the amount of activity that we have from the Corrientes guys and gals for our cattle producers, I think we'd whip Washington over in a heartbeat, because they are very fired up, and they should be. You saw a lack of a short go at the Cheyenne Frontier days just because they couldn't afford them roping calves coming up there. So, yeah, I think it just goes back. So, yeah, obviously we stick to the policy of U.S. cattle producers, but yes, that has certainly been that with the sport and rodeo side of things, that challenge that's faced. And that's, that's a part of the entertainment, the other side they're all a part of. From the cow-calf perspective, Jenna spoke really, really well on the animal health side. Very, very technical. Again, I just encourage folks, obviously, if you're here, you're always going to do that shameless plug. I'll say, get involved in all the organizations. I'm pretty biased. I think Montana has some tremendous ag state associations. We work well with all of them. Get involved, because you're seeing that technical element on the animal health committee that we worked through. Here's where I'm going to come at as the old senior policy advisor, grumbling a little bit. Well, we haven't modernized our competition policies at all. We haven't. Now, I spent my entire career advocating for increased cash trade and putting that in play, because these cattle coming in, do I have sympathy towards our packing capacity and feeding capacity in the South? Absolutely. But do I have sympathy and loyalty to the cow-calf producer and the independent cattle feeder in the Midwest that drives the cash trade? Both of you do a phenomenal job reporting on the markets. And the number one thing that you get excited about is when cash breaks. And I hear it in your voices. And as a listener, we're waiting for that. And what did cash do, right? What did cash do? Cash is still king. And what you just see right now, and I'll say this to all my friends on the border, you just brought in a whole crud ton of formula cattle that's got no linkage to cash. And that's, I won't say criminal, but it ain't where it should be. And so it needs to have competition. So if they want to put these formula cattle in, because that's what they are in these feed yards, fine. But you better find a way to increase the cash trade on that. That's why we had the Cattle Market Price Discovery Act that said you had to have I hate putting mandates out there. Go out there and cash trade. Now, I don't know. It's a little bit of a, we'll see what happens. You all watch, because of the lack of actual cattle out there force them to be active in the cash. Will that remain? When will you see the rise of the formula cattle and the lack of the cash trade? So you all are going to watch that. As Jenna mentioned, what are we doing? We're looking at two things. We're making sure, as Jenna talked about, that retail price, if that retail price softens or it stays high and cattle producers get dinged, we're watching that. That's anti-competitive. We're going to nail them on that. And the second one is, these are a lot of formula cattle. So we're going to keep pushing and reinvigorate. Again, you talked about Animal Health Committee, get involved. Marketing Committee, get involved. We need to increase this cash trade of cattle, and we're going to watch it like a hawk. We've got contracts out there. We talked about futures on the CME side. Yeah, there's a big debate on the MCOOL side. I'm still a big believer, because I've spent my entire career working on country boards and labeling. That voluntary system they have in place, I can hear, oh gosh, it never work. Go look at the numbers. Go look at what's being labeled. You don't go out to your ranch and just say, well, I think everything's fine on the waters. I think everything's fine on the grass. I can look for my living room. So don't sit there and say, we're not getting any labeling done. We're not getting any advancement done. Look at where we're at with labeling. See where that voluntary label is growing. Hats off to Secretary Rollins. Hats off to U.S. Cattlemen's. It was Leo Biondo's legacy to get these definitions in place. So I think we're good, and this is where we roll up our sleeves, and this is why you have an organization in Washington, D.C.
Well, and there's just a lot of tools, like you talked about, Jess. We can go to the Product of USA labeling. They continue to announce, new corporations, new businesses keep coming on every single week. We just saw Agri-Beef in Idaho. They just came on Product of USA label. That's just another tool and another advantage to try to help mitigate the risk when you do open the border and come through. And of course, like you said, we'll be watching that cash market pretty heavily. I know when we compare cash to grid pricing, that's a whole other conversation on its own. But when you talk about that formula cattle coming through, that's the premium that we're nervous about. If they come through, that cash market drops, but the retail prices stay high, that's going to impact the cow-calf producer. And all the guys that marketed their calves in June and July, they're going to look like heroes, because late fall, when you deliver those on those video sales, or as we all know, the fall markets come to hit pretty heavy, there could be some severe pressure, and that's when we could start to see those side effects come through.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, this isn't the only thing that we've been focused on, or that the U.S. Cattlemen's Association has been focused on anyways. Of course, back earlier this month, we saw the U.S. Trump administration come out and say that beef is not going to be on these Brazilian tariffs. That's Section 303 of the tariffs. And you guys come out and said, this falls short.
Yeah, we have been involved in USTR investigations under Section 301 for the last multiple administrations. So we saw two different pieces come out this time. So we testified, the initial investigation into Brazil specifically happened last year after the inauguration. So we testified back in September of last year when they were in the investigation, in the thick of it, needed some evidence, and we provided all of that to them, testified there, and had good conversations with USTR at that point. And we have a great working relationship with Ambassador Greer, with Ambassador Julie Callahan, a fabulous ag team over at USTR and in the trade division of USDA as well, with Undersecretary Lindbergh. Ultimately, what we saw, which we expected post all of the, last time we were all talking last December, all of the Argentina craziness that happened in the fall, we were expecting Brazilian beef to be exempt from that tariff, even though they had found in the investigation that Brazil was guilty of doing all the things that they were alleged. Our testimony focused on illegal deforestation. And there's significant ties into the legacy of our Director Emeritus, Leo McDonnell, who's worked on this for a very long time, that is backed by forced labor on the Brazilian production side. And it's just, for so many reasons, is completely wrong and biased. But our guys produce the best beef in the entire world. And for them to be able to compete with beef that's produced with lower input costs and be able to be sometimes marketed higher here, the playing field is not level. Something's not right. To your point, Andy, we saw that announcement come out where we knew that Brazilian beef was going to be exempt from those tariffs. We've continued conversations with USTR, and we don't plan on stopping anytime soon. Obviously, there's different agendas going on. That was a decision that was going to be made. But what we know and what that investigation told us and that announcement announcement ultimately is that, yes, we found Brazil guilty of doing all of the things that you all said that they did, which is more of an acknowledgement that we've gotten in the last few administrations. So we're very excited about that. What we found last Thursday, there was an announcement on a different investigation that we were involved in under just forced labor pretenses. So that had about 60 nations in it, and very similar to the Brazilian one, but focusing on countries who are importing from other countries who utilize forced labor. So in our investigation and in discovery that we provided to USTR and did also in the Argentine announcement last fall, is that Argentina has a very similar herd crisis to what we have here in the United States. They've got drought, they've got low herd numbers, just a very similar situation to what we have here. They're downsizing as well. They've got operations closing doors and going liquid. So they have to get their beef from somewhere because now they're supplying excess to the United States and in other places as well. They're exporting like crazy. Well, it's got to come from somewhere, and it makes sense that it comes from Brazil. So what we offer to USTR is that, if this is going to occur, if we're going to take in more beef from countries like this that operate at a lower standard and probably offer us much lower quality than what we offer here, not probably, definitely, then there should be some tariffs. There has to be, we have to move somewhere. We have to at least look like we're trying to level the playing field because our producers deserve that from us. And that's on our government to make that right. On Thursday, that announcement came out that, again, many of those countries were guilty of doing exactly what we offered. Unfortunately, beef is again exempt from that. So I think, let's get into the fall run and kind of see, to Colton's point earlier, what these prices are going to do and what the retail looks like through the end of the year, get through the holiday beef season. And I think it'll be a bit of a different conversation, but not one that we plan on stopping to have anytime soon.
Speaking of the meat, we got to talk about the meat demand monitor as well. The consumer, I think, has proven the fact that, hey, we really don't care about the price. We care about the protein, and that they've been driving themselves to the grocery stores like you talked about earlier, and they've been actually purchasing that beef at the elevated prices that they were. But 5-6 weeks ago, we're down $50 a hundredweight on some of these box beef prices. What are you guys seeing on the meat demand monitor as we kind of work through these hot dog days of summer right now?
Absolutely. And I want to backtrack to kind of the origin of the meat demand monitor, and huge shout out to our predecessor, Leah Biondo, who that was just her life's work to make that happen. So the meat demand monitor is a project that we have that's funded by the Beef Checkoff, and we've had that partnership we're now in our third cycle, so our 7th year, and have just had amazing success. We work with Dr. Glenn Tonser out of Kansas State University, who I know you all talk with a good amount. So what we found on the meat demand monitor, it's not a forecasting tool, and that's okay, because at the time when it was created, that wasn't what the industry needed. We needed to know where the consumer was buying. I think there's some interest in, what specific cuts consumers are buying, where the demand is on that side. And it's good to compare it against other proteins. Not that we want to alienate our other commodities, but we want to know how beef is performing. And what we've seen over the last 7 years, especially since, 2021, we just saw a complete influx in consumption and demand. And those numbers tell us, and again, back to our market signals conversation beforehand, it's good for our producers because it tells them to stay in business. If we've got beef flying off the shelves at record prices, that's a pretty good signal for a guy who's trying to figure out if he's going to sell off in the fall or if he's going to hold some back. So that matters to us. And it also matters for our guys who are doing, their direct to consumer sales. It lets them know there's some price value that we look at on specific cuts. And that's really helpful, I think, for those guys when they're doing their marketing. But it's also good to, in our conversations with policy folks as well, it's good for them to know that consumers are buying beef, they're continuing to buy it. And one of the metrics that we watch for is the values, the protein values, we call them, that consumers are paying attention to when they're buying beef. So one of those pieces is looking at what do consumers value the most. So we see price perform again and again and again, but we see taste and freshness above anything. Consumers care most about their taste value. And that's the reason that they keep coming back to beef, and we don't see them quitting anytime soon.
Absolutely. Love hearing that. That's excellent to hear and, think about. And Jess, let's hear your personal take. What is your favorite cut of beef?
Oh, my gosh.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah. That's the great thing about beef. It's an experience on so many levels. I remember walking into this salad place in DC, and they went from like some fake deal like tofu or something. Then they started putting chicken in. I finally did what you ought to do in DC when you got a little bit of leverage. You go to the lobbyist and say, why the heck aren't you putting beef with those salads? Because beef overpowers it. Beef is the experience. We're not putting it on a salad menu. And again, this is the mixed salad, bowl situation. When it was kind of the rave, back in the day when I was out there running around. You look at any cut, right? mean, it's really, really hard to just stare at a menu that's got an amazing filet, and you're like, I only got so many of them in my freezer, and I'm like, I'm doing the filet, right? But if I'm out there, like we were at the Northern, like, give me the ribeye, give me the New York. When I'm out there, no, it's going to be a good time. As I get a little older, my preferences change too, right? It's like, what time is it? Yeah, slap that old New York on there. Yeah, you know what? That filet is going to do just fine tonight. But that's what beef is. It's all about that experience that we found. And, even now, just what we've done with the meat demand monitor. Now, I always ran it in Raven when I was in DC. Find the folks that do the pot roast. Find the folks that can cook it on a Tuesday night, a Wednesday night. And then, whether it's a smaller cut of steak, they can ding Walmart all they want. Walmart looked at the size of the steaks and said, we're going to move meat. And Walmart's a big buyer in these video sales. Don't kid yourself. And they're driving that demand. So getting that steak that's the right size, the right fit, but then turn around, getting a pot roast, turn it into your barbecue beef, making your different burger delicacies, where you just, I do a lot of direct to consumer. The burger is what people keep coming back for. So I think it's the experience. We even saw Wall Street Journal had a piece come out the other day about just what it was like dining at a big Kansas City steakhouse. They literally asked the guy, I don't care how expensive it gets, I will pay for it. That is a success story for every one of your listeners. And frankly, for what Northern Ag has done for all these years of talking about beef, of talking about what it is, the values and whatnot. So it's a huge, huge deal. I've been one to work on governance my entire life in the beef checkoff, but to see that research piled, and who's using it? The retailers asked for it, the restaurants asked for it, even the Breed Association. I won't just pull out CAB, although Certified Angus Beef did a phenomenal job. The rest of them, Hereford, Simmental, Red Angus, they've all looked at that demand saying, how can we lock up with this? So it's a true success story. I feel really good. Even as we look at any type of uncertainty in the global level, we have some great components in place for a very strong and vibrant U.S. cattle industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's just wrap up with this last thing that's happened this summer. Of course, the Spur program come out from the USDA that kind of focused on, helping out some of those mid-sized processors. And I know you guys were paying close attention with this and probably had some conversations with the USDA when that Spur announcement came out.
Well, we're super excited to see that come out right ahead of the July 4th grilling holiday. That was great to see. And the Spur program is just a really great extension of the MPEPs and all of those assistance programs that have been offered to these small and mid-sized guys who are really just trying to make it. And I think what is important, and we do appreciate USDA making the Spur program a priority. There's heavy investment there. But what is going to be so important as we see this rollout is that we are talking with those small and mid-sized folks, those independent processors, and asking them, what is it that you need to stay in business long term? Short-term capital investment, absolutely essential. We know that the capital investment to get into processing is just a very heavy burden. So we understand them from the capital aspect, but what do you need long term to really, make these dollars work for you in the best way and make sure that you have some return on that investment, and that USDA sees that there's a good investment to be had in investing in these small and mid-sized processors. So those are the conversations that we're having with some folks here in Montana this week, just getting a handle on where are the dollars being spent. Are you guys using it on marketing? Are you using it in updating your capacity? Are you to expand capacity, updating technology? What is the best way that this funding is going to be used? And we do that not necessarily from a transparency aspect, but we want to be able to tell USDA that, look, these small and mid-sized folks, they're using this funding. It's good for their communities. They're giving back. They're making sure that there's farm to school programs that are coming out of these processors. We're making sure that it's good for the community as well. There's good investment there. So we're really excited to see what that rollout looks like, and we'll be paying attention to those pieces.
Really appreciate you guys making the trip out here to hear firsthand from the ranchers. Before we hop off, are we missing anything? Is there anything else that the producers need to know about as we move forward through this summer?
Well, I think it's going to get a little bit more real. And I don't say that for anybody. And I don't like saying, increase, profitability and what. We're always looking to do that. I think it's going to get a little bit more real. You look up right now, tech startups, most of your startups, they don't make a profit. Not that I want to compare this to ranching, but when you have venture capital backing some of this stuff up, you're talking a 10 to 15 year ratio before it ever comes into earnings. Now look at a lot of what's happening on ranchers right now. They have kept it together. We've sat in your very program saying, keep it together through the droughts, through the tough markets, through everything that we get thrown at us. Keep it together on your operation so that you can actually get a return value, what you actually deserve for these cattle. So we saw that in the last few years. I say they were catching up for the last 10 to 15 or more. I won't put a placeholder on that. So from our perspective, it's going to be exciting. If it softens, where does that softening mark come at? But what makes me extremely excited is I would have never in my entire career, if you and I looked at each other in the beginning, say, beef can get, I won't even say here because it keeps going higher, but cattle gets here, beef gets here, menu prices get, this high. and consumers stayed with us. So I hope and pray, and we're going to advocate accordingly, that if there is a softening, it doesn't just drop. And that's why you have a group like U.S. Cattlemen. That's why you have all the state associations that come on here. That's why you have a Northern Ag Network. That's why you have the 15 different ways of getting your news and up to date. Be active, be involved, because honestly, a lot of the stuff Jenna's talking about, this was driven by producers. I know, we might sound intelligent, more intelligent when you're on this podcast, obviously, but it comes from the producer saying, hey, tap the helmet there, Biff, get it right. And so as we move forward, it's time to roll back up our sleeves. I just talked about some of these competition issues we're going to have to bring to the forefront. U.S. Cattlemen is well positioned to do that. I'm extremely excited. I would always look for these market crashes. I think it can soften. And I think it can rally right back again because the consumer's there with meat demand, the production where it needs to be at, and folks are in it to win it. So I think we have a great success model. Now it's about getting active. You have some great fall meetings for folks to get involved. They have great ways to get involved in Northern Ag. Keep it up, stay in it, and thanks everybody for what you do out in cattle country and beyond.
Yeah, and a big thank you to you guys as well, because all of us out here in the West think this 100-degree temperatures that we've been having all year long is a lot. You should add humidity to it, and that's what these guys deal with in Washington, D.C. Of course, you can always find all the details for U.S. Cattlemen's online at uscattlemen.org. For Jess Peterson, the Senior Policy Advisor, and Jenna Stanton, Director of Policy and Public Affairs, thank you guys for coming in.
Well, now to wrap things up, taking a look at our markets. First, want to give a shout out to Western Ranch Supply. Of course, it's county fair season, and there are few bigger supporters of 4-H and FFA youth than Western Ranch Supply. I don't know how many dozens of animals they'll buy across the state and across the region, but we sure appreciate Shane and Keith and the crew. Western Ranch Supply, of course, Montana owned and operated, proudly serving farmers and ranchers with quality products and trusted expertise for more than 70 years. They're trusted by generations because they're built by generations. And now let's dig into these markets. A lot of stuff to talk about with the slew of USDA reports we got back on Friday. I don't know, where do you guys want to start? Cattle on feed, is that the easiest place to start?
I think that is, because
that's
that's a good warm-up, because that is kind of, that report came in pretty much where we anticipated it to. Cattle on feed up 2%, total inventory up 2% of those cattle on feed. Cattle placed in the feedlots a little bit less than expected, that they were down 3% versus thinking they were going to be down 2%. Cattle marketed out of the feedlots down 3% year over year. So when we saw that report come out, it was viewed as pretty neutral. You might have said it could have leaned bullish with less cattle getting placed in the feedlots, but the on-feed number and the less marketing certainly pulled back the bullish perspective and overshadowed that for sure. But this is going to be a number that's obviously going to change here in the coming months with these cattle starting to slowly be rephased and opening the U.S.-Mexico border to those cattle coming north from Mexico. But in the end of the day, when that border was wide open, it only accounted for about 5% of the total inventory. So is it going to increase that much? I don't think so in the end of the day.
Well, I think we're just seeing the same story continuing to play out with these cattle on feed reports, and that's we're keeping these animals on feed longer to heavier weights, and so that inflates the overall total inventory. Certainly, we're seeing it out of the marketings. I think it was the lowest June marketings on record this month, so I think we're continuing to see that story. One factor, as you look down at the weights that are being placed on feed, the decline is really in the yearlings. We just don't have the number of yearlings to put on feed, and so that's being made up with lighter weight calves, under 600 pounds. And so I think that's the trend that's going to be interesting to watch, especially as we've seen a lot of yearling feeder cattle marketed early. Those feedlots are reaching down to lighter weights because the yearling pipeline is running thin. And so that's going to be an interesting factor here. But yeah, I think probably is largely a neutral report, and it'll be interesting to see how these Mexican cattle impacted. Of course, it'll take time. It'll probably be fourth quarter before we're really seeing measurable results out of that.
I think that was, and we talked about that in the interview. We can talk about it a lot more next week too. But that decision to bring the Mexican cattle back, it's gonna really help the southern producers and our southern infrastructure. I don't think it's gonna hurt what we're seeing as far as on feed numbers more than what the trend is already lying. But to your point, Coulter, I thought it was really interesting as we're watching the summer video season. Prices have been absolutely impressive when we see a lot of those lightweight calves that they keep saying are replacement quality, the replacement type cattle. Are they going to producers, or are the feedlot guys buying them and putting them on feed? And I think this report showed that influx of those lighter 5 and 6 weight steers and heifers. That just shows you who's buying a lot of these cattle, who's able to round them up and where they're going. And so, again, it's just as we are adding more days on feed, it's just going to kind of trickle down, and we're going to see it get backed up as we continue on with these on feed numbers.
Well, another thing that we saw come out on Friday, right along with that cattle on feed report, was the biannual cattle inventory report. As you guys probably heard from some of our programs, it showed that total cattle inventory across the nation up slightly. And when I say up slightly, I'm talking from 94 million head in 2025 to 94.2 million head in 2026. Yeah, it is up slightly. Technically, the USDA called it steady with what last year's figures were, because it's not a huge jump. 200,000 head, not a huge increase. Does that qualify for a herd rebuild? I don't think so. Here's why I don't think so. Total beef cow numbers total 28.5 million head. That's down. That's down 1% from year ago levels. The part where I can't really fully swing for the fences and say that we're not in a herd rebuild yet is at the beef replacement heifers. They totaled 3.8 million head, and that's up 3% from year ago levels. Does that mean that we're starting to see some producers holding back heifers? I think that jump makes it kind of have some validity to that statement.
Yeah, I would say I think it means we're moving down that path, but we ain't very far down that path. I mean, 3% increase sounds fairly significant. It's 100,000 head.
True.
And so you got 100,000 more replacement heifers, 200,000 less beef cows. And so I think that kind of shows the push and pull we've got here from some areas that are affected by drought and they're culling cows and they're reducing numbers. And some areas the rains come and now they're retaining a little bit of heifers. But really, when you talk about seeing 200,000 head worth of growth in the overall cow herd, some of that's coming in the on-feed numbers. I think a significant portion of that is coming from the dairy industry.
Side. Yep.
The dairy industry, obviously, they've been keeping these cows longer and longer and longer just to get another calf out of them. You know, that beef on dairy cross feeding their bottom lines. And we've started to see the dairy replacement heifer number increase. So they're trying to address that issue of an aging dairy herd. But boy, when you put it all together, I think you're right, Andy, that we're just kind of holding steady here. Maybe that equates to very modest growth by the time we get to January, but I sure don't see it. I mean, this is the smallest calf crop we've ever had this year at what, 32.5
million. Yeah, that was what I was going to bring up is where we're looking at this. So replacement heifers were up 3%. Like you said, it's around 100,000, give or take some rounding on that. I don't know if that's enough to do it, especially when we're looking at 32.5 million for our calf crop for the year. And then when we look at the breakdown and the on-feed heifers still make up 37%. We can talk all day on what's that magic number, right? Is it 37? Is it 37.5? Is it 36.8? When they start making up that much of the on-feed numbers, when are we really starting to see that trend take place? So I think there's indication here, but listening to some analysts and economists talk about this, now we have kind of that foundation, right? So as we look at these quarterly reports and the biannual inventory reports that are coming through, this is our foundation. So next report that comes out, we need to look and see, are we seeing replacement heifers higher than 3.8 million? And are we seeing less than 37% heifers in the on-feed numbers? That's going to indicate our trend, right? So in the next report, if we see 3.9 million and 36.7% in the heifer on feed, that's going to indicate that growth. But again, we've all talked about how this is not going to be what we've seen in the past. This is going to be a very slow, gradual growth. So I think we might have lit the torch a little bit, but it's still going to take a long time for us to really see the numbers come through.
And the thing I'm looking at too is the drought that we're seeing widespread across many of these Western states. A lot of producers, they don't even have their cattle anymore right now. They've sold them off already. So I might be willing to go to Vegas and put some money on the table about the numbers in January, because I don't think we're going to see a herd rebuild. I said it, I think 2 weeks ago, I think we're going to see a pullback in numbers when it comes to January.
I think this report, though, just puts a lot more weight on that January report, because now we've kind of saw a slight indication of it. So now that January, it's going to hold a lot of weight when it comes to where we actually sitting after that fall run.
Well, in 10, 12 years ago in the last cycle, that was, I think, the fastest we've ever grown the herd. We retained heifers and we all saw how fast the market turned. Obviously, this is going to be a much slower growth. I mean, this is the first time we've seen an increase in replacement heifer inventory in a decade.
Yeah.
So significant, but we've got a long ways to go. But I think when you couple what we've got in the inventory report and what we've seen in the video sales over the last month, the signs are there that retention is on the minds of producers if they've got the grass. And so I don't think we'll see substantial growth. I think you'll probably get to January and see less than 1%. But the path is laid out in front of us. It's just you can't go very far down there until it rains.
Absolutely. Well, video sales season, of course, in full swing. We got a slate of video sales that we'll be talking about that are upcoming that you need to put on your calendar if they're not already. But want to look back just a little bit. Of course, Northern Livestock Video Auction wrapped up their summertime classic. Good head counts coming out of those heavy 5-weight steers, averaging right at 480 a 100-weight, 6-weight steers, the lighter end of them. 455 a 100-weight, 5-weight steers averaging nearly 516 a 100-weight. The big surprise, though, was kind of how tight the heifers were behind them. You certainly saw it more on day one of the video auction than you did the rest of the week as that 3-day sale continued throughout the early part of last week. But on that first day, about 11 cents back on the heifers. And I was counting them, I was saying that steers, or the 5-weight steers, were right about 511, 510, 100-weight, and the heifers were right about 499. There's demand for those heifers. And then you put the word replacement heifers with them, and there was even more demand for them, it seemed like.
Well, and in some of those weight classes, the heifers were dollar for dollar up there with the steers on certain lots. And I think, again, that's just slight indications of what we're seeing there. The need and the desire to rebuild is there. You want to grow. It's just who's capable of it and who can afford to at this price right now too. I think a big thing is we head into it. I know you'll mention it here later, Andy, but of course when Northern Livestock hosted their fall sale, we do see a decent replacement heifer section of that sale. I'm really curious to see how those values and those prices are going to hold up, because I think that's kind of the kickoff before the big fall run as the video summer sale season comes to an end, and that might just keep the ball rolling as we head into fall time to see what those heifers are truly worth.
Well, those quality replacements, though, through the roof. I mean, there was one lot of 620-pound heifers brought $3,500 a head.
Yeah.
I mean, that's big money if the quality's there. And to the point of talking about our guys retaining, a year ago, 62% of the offering in the Summertime Classic was steers. This year is 68%. I think that's a significant difference. I didn't look at it, but I think if you compared just the average weight of heifers in this sale, heifer calves, I think it'd be lower than it was last year. And there may be some drought influence on there, but I think guys are keeping their good ones back and they're selling the light ones. And of course, we'll see how this year turns. There may be an opportunity to market some more heifer calves if the market keeps up like it is, but I can never remember seeing as thin of a spread between steers and heifers as what we saw last week.
And how much does the coal cow market weigh into those decisions right now too? Because as you mentioned, it seems there are producers holding back those heifers, and when the coal cow market is as high as it is, I feel like that's just an even easier indication that keep the young ones back, sell some of the old cows if you need, but try to keep more of those replacement quality heifers back to get this rebuild going.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one thing we've seen in this cattle cycle is that coal cow market has been extremely seasonal. I mean, we've went to crazy levels we never thought we would, but it followed the same pattern, a little bit of softening in the cow market. That'll probably continue here for another month or 6 weeks. We'll get to the fall. The cows are going to cheapen up because everybody sells cows in the fall. Likely move higher into the winter. That's just what we see. But certainly there's a lot of noise out there that could affect it. Will these Mexican cattle coming in? Will we increase imports? How's that going to affect these cow values? A lot of unknowns. The other thing I would just touch on, if you watch the lambs sell it all, video or even just at Pays or the Newell sheep yards, they're 50 to 80% above where they were last year. This lamb market is red hot, and so it's darn good news for the sheep producers. We spend so much time talking on the cattle end of this thing, but boy, I don't know if it can get a lot better for the sheep guys. I bet it can, but holy smokes.
It seems every report's up another $10 to $15 per week on a lot of these new crop lambs. Exciting to see for sure.
Yeah, be interesting to see how the ram sales do here coming up as well. Those are not going to be very far away. Of course, Montana and Wyoming always on that same week, then wrap up with Newell. That's always in mid-September, so be sure to watch our events calendar, northernag.net. Also, while you're checking it out, check out some of the other video sales that are coming up. Cattle Country Video holding their Oregon Trail Classic. That's going to be actually August 4th and 5th. 51,000 head offered in that offering. Western Video Market, they're going to be in Cheyenne at Little America on August 10th and 11th. Live Ag holding their commercial load lots in Cody, Wyoming on their video auction August 13th. The following week, we got Northern Livestock Video Auction's early fall preview August 17th through the 18th. And then, of course, that same week, Superior Livestock in Sheridan for the Bighorn Classic August 17th through the 21st. So a lot of video sales coming up, and certainly going to really kind of define what the fall prices could look like. As you guys mentioned, though, a lot of factors will weigh in on that as well. Well, let's switch over a little bit here to from cattle to our grain guys and kind of look at the conditions that we're seeing across the country on most of the spring wheat condition. Here was the interesting fact here. So the spring wheat conditions, they actually fell just slightly, I believe, in a week over week comparison across the nation. They're sitting 53% good to excellent. Of course, the top producing state, North Dakota, they're sitting 52% good to excellent. Montana, they rose 18% in a week over week comparison, now sitting 43% good to excellent. That comes following 95 to 100 degree temperatures across much of Montana. That was the biggest surprise to me, in my opinion.
Well, I think it was quite evident on our For the Farmers tour. All of those guys were saying this is some of the best spring crop we've seen in a long time. And I definitely looked like it as we were traveling up Conrad all the way up dang near to Sunburst. Their spring wheat was looking really good.
It's not going to be uncommon in the triangle for spring wheat to yield higher than winter wheat this year.
Yeah.
I think the surprising part to me was also last week, you had the hard red spring wheat tour in North Dakota and western Minnesota, and that forecast yields lower than last year, which I thought we heard this is going to be a great big spring wheat crop, high yields, but hearing that kind of provides a little bit of support to the market that, of course, North Dakota being the number one spring wheat producer, if their yields are down, that's going to decrease the supply end, so maybe there'll be some opportunity there.
Interesting to me was they, of course, started on the eastern side of North Dakota, started working west. That's where they were finding those low bushels per acre. But then you jump across the state border to Minnesota, they're sitting 88% good to excellent right now on that crop conditions report. Not that Minnesota's the biggest spring wheat producing state, but enough to garnish at least a USDA reports. And so interesting to see that. You know, another thing though that we talk about these hot temperatures, unfortunately, what it's really impacting is the range conditions and those pasture conditions. Wyoming, as of this week, the USDA called them 69% poor to very poor. Montana's, it's, I think, 41% poor to very poor. You look at the soil moisture, 86% short to very short in Wyoming. Their subsoil moisture, I think it was 88% short to very short. So if anybody could send a rain cloud to my home state of Wyoming, they would all appreciate it.
Well, on that pasture and rangeland report, looking at some of the commentary, there were only two of the top 10 beef producing states that saw improvement, Montana and Florida. And Montana was up over 10% from last week in the good to excellent category. So again, kind of what we saw in the spring wheat crop conditions, definitely some improvement here to the state. Now, next week might be a different story as we're seeing a lot of the hot temperatures come through. But again, I think speaks a lot of volume to these producers right now. And that rain just really made a difference and kind of turned people around.
Well, and to end on a hopeful note, just today I was looking at the NOAA drought forecast, which they go out 3 months into the future. So looking out to the end of October, and they're showing all of Wyoming into southern Montana with drought improvement in the early part of the fall. They're saying drought removal or improvement for all of Wyoming and southern Montana. So that was honestly the best news I had seen in a long time. So I just had to tell somebody.
Had to share it.
I got some good news too from Justin Iverson, of course, over there at Potomac. He was cutting hay here this last week and said that they had a lot of water. The alfalfa a little bit behind because of it's actually been not the best growing conditions for them, but certainly good rains and making up for the lack of snow that they felt over this last winter. So good to hear from everybody. If you have anything, if you're out there and you say, you know, I got to tell these guys what's going on in my neck of the woods, feel free, shoot us a message, find our information. We got it all on our website, northernag.net. I'd love to hear from you guys. And Colton, next week, we're not going to speculate wildly any more than what we could today on the cattle inventory report and the cattle on feed report, because you got an expert coming in.
We do. We're going to see how far off all of us are on our predictions and estimates. We'll have Shaylee Stewart with DTN, livestock analyst. She's just a wealth of knowledge, and so she'll be coming in to join us, and we'll dive into those reports and get a little fall outlook and see what she's seeing. Of course, her and her family live just outside of Cody, Wyoming, so I'm sure she's hearing a lot from both Wyoming and Montana producers, and it'll be a great conversation. Like I said, she's a wealth of knowledge, so we'll dive in pretty heavily on those reports and what the outlook is for this cattle inventory.
Absolutely. Going to be a great conversation. We appreciate you guys staying tuned in with us throughout this entire podcast. We have all the details and everything on our website, northernag.net, as that's going to wrap us up today. For Colton Brown and Colton Young, I'm Andy Schwab. Next Year Country Podcast.